So imagine a picturesque old man with a determined walk and a cane in his hand, walking down Franklin, Pennsylvania. That's how he was described in the newspaper article that I read. They talked about him being a staple in the town that he lived in. They talked about him and his story and his family. They documented him pretty well, to include his children and what his children did. This old man has stories to tell, and he didn't mind telling them. But if you met him on any street back in those days in the 1920s, he just looked like another really nice old man walking down the street with a cane in his hand. A cane that he needed because of the wounds that he received right here at Gettysburg. Walking from the right flank marker here on Mcpherson's, right in front of Mcpherson's barn of the 150th Pennsylvania, we're here to tell a story about a man who shot not once, not twice, but 3 times. And he would go on to live quite a storied life afterwards and survive the Battle of Gettysburg. Born October 28th of 1842, James Monroe Reisinger would be right here on this ridgeline near the Mcpherson's barn on the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg. And here on this ridgeline, he would meet those Confederates here, really for the first time. And they would bring fire to this ridge as the Bucktails would push them off that line behind me directly there, down the ridge below, and then get hit real hard and have to fall back to the point to where I'm at right now. Corporal Reisinger was a color bearer, and that is a very difficult job. Born to Charles and Providence Reisinger, he was part of a family that was part farmers, part blacksmiths. His dad decided to move away from where he was originally when he was 2 years old and move him to another part of Pennsylvania so that his son could get a better education. And his son did that. He took advantage of it. He spent 3 years at a college before going into the oil fields. And eventually, the Civil War would erupt, shortening his education and sending him straight into the American Civil War. In August of 1862, he finally decides to join, and he becomes part of Company H of the 150th Pennsylvania. That's how he ends up being the color bearer and ends up here in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. You can see off in the distance there that one small little marker right out there. That is the right flank, roughly, where the 150th Pennsylvania sat when they took this ridge line and were facing in this direction here when the Confederates were coming up over that ridge line and through the muddy marsh that's down below. There's a stream that's out there in those woods. You can take a trail to go down to it and actually see it for yourself. And there used to be, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere out there, there used to be a large hotel that was out in that area too. The footprint's still out there for the hotel, but the place is long since gone. We're now going to take a walk down to where the left flank marker is and kind of give you an idea as to how far this is. And I'll see if I can't put a map from the GPS up here to show you the points on the map, because that right flank marker is just in front of the Mcpherson barn and runs all the way down through here to this location. This is that left flank. So if you take a look, the men stood from here all the way back to that location just past that monument right there. We're talking somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe 350 or so men positioned along this fence line, facing off in this direction here. So it was about 2 p.m. on that day, July 1st, that he ends up meeting that first bullet. He's along this fence line here behind me, and he reports that his men got up to that fence line, and most of the flag bearers were down. Him and one Sergeant Pfeffer were the only two that were still available. They climb over that fence line and they start running down that ridge line over there towards the Confederates. And about that time, the Confederates got support that came up. As he's headed down towards that area, he feels a sharp pain in his right foot. He realizes a small lead ball has hit him in the big toe and has wedged in the ball of his foot. He continues to try to get up and walk around, realizes he can limp around on the heel, the ball of the heel. So he grabs his flag, and even though he's being urged to run back and get help, he picks up that flag, he takes off, and he continues to fight. Then the Confederates push them back here, out in these fields, where the farm was. And the house used to stand out here too. He's out right near where the house was, and the Confederates are fighting and pushing them back down this hill. When they finally get to the point to where they can recuperate and start heading back in that direction, they start coming back up this hill straight to that fence line. And as he's making his way up there, he feels an earth-shattering pain that hits him just above the right knee. And the ball runs down his leg, wedges in the bone behind his kneecap. He hits the ground immediately, writhing in pain, can't walk anymore, can't do anything. Well, as that happens, he decides he's going to try to get back up. Somebody tries to help him out. They get him up off the ground. He grabs his standard and he starts to head back towards that fence line. And that's when it happens. Another ball hits him in the right hip and runs down into his groin and takes him completely out. And at that point, he says that he was so weak that he couldn't even bring his gun up to his face to take aim and fire. And he laid out here on these fields, bleeding and writhing in pain. Well, after that first day, he ends up going to the hospital and they start working on him. And he survives this battle. But it takes him almost an entire year to recuperate from the wounds that he received here at Gettysburg. Eventually, he ends up going into Company B of the 14th Reserves. It's like a reserve unit for injured men who can no longer serve in the field. And in 1865, June of 1865, he's mustered out of the army that fought so valiantly during the American Civil War. He ends up re-enlisting, and he becomes an officer for the 114th USCT, U.S. Colored Troops. And he serves for about 2 years in Texas with them. And he finally leaves the military after those 2 years. But his story carries on from there. I'll give a bit of a different perspective of where this man fought. You can see the barn right out in front of me there, and the house would have been out in this area. And he fought till right about in this position here. So he was one of the flag bearers that came up through this field, going up to that fence line, over that fence line down into the ridges below, and then being pushed back to this position here. Eventually, the position becomes untenable. It's something that they can no longer use, and they have to move further back. The 150th fighting isn't over out here in these fields. They have to continue to fight, and they have a monument over on Hancock Avenue, I believe, where Pickett's charge took place. And they fought throughout the rest of the battle. But out here on these fields, they brought about 350 to 360 men out here with them. And out of all those men, a little over 290 of them would walk away with some kind of a casualty, scar, or they'd end up missing out here on these fields. Later on in his life, Roe would end up recounting a story where he would have been invited to the White House by the president, Abraham Lincoln. While he was at that White House, he ends up accidentally getting to see Abraham Lincoln give his final public address from the balcony of the White House. Roe was a nice old man, and he always told his story to anyone that wanted to hear it. He was a hunter, and he was a lawyer, and he worked for an oil company. He wouldn't receive his Medal of Honor until 1907. That's how long it took them to award him for his bravery here at Gettysburg. But he did receive it, and he didn't make that big of a deal out of it. He always talked about his service in a positive light, and he always told anybody his story that wanted to hear it. He was just that kind of a person. Strong, determined man who at 20 years old was a pretty important color bearer here on this field in Gettysburg. Just an amazing story. In 1870, Roe ends up passing the bar exam, and he practices law for 15 years. Then he ends up going on to be a part of, I believe it's the Galena oil industry, working for them for a very long time before they're taken over by Valvoline. Later on, he would die in 1925 at the age of 82. He had one daughter with one wife who grows up to be an art teacher. He had another son named James. James will grow up to be a lieutenant colonel in the 85th Division during World War I. What an amazing view. Well, I hope you've enjoyed the story here about Mr. Rowe himself, the color bearer for the 150th Pennsylvania. McPherson's Ridge and the barn in the background. I couldn't think of any better place to end that story right here than where the man stood on these fields all those years ago and bled right here on these grounds. Bled for the Union. Until next time, this is History with Waffles.